the song that shook the crowd. The hall was heavy with silence before the music even began. Thousands of people had gathered in the grand auditorium, its walls glowing with soft yellow light, and yet it felt as though every person inside was holding their breath. Cameras were pointed at the stage. Journalists were scribbling, and the air was filled with the unspoken weight of expectation. Prime Minister Modi sat in the front row, his hands resting quietly on his lap. Beside him were ministers, leaders, teachers, and students from across India, all waiting for what was said to be a simple cultural performance. No one imagined that within a few minutes the atmosphere in that room would change forever. When Kavya, a 12-year-old girl with two braids and eyes that carried both innocence and courage, stepped onto the stage, the spotlight softened. Her school uniform looked too large for her small frame, but her presence had a gravity that pulled everyone closer. She held the microphone tightly, her knuckles pale, and for a moment she stood frozen. You could almost hear her heartbeat echoing in the silence. Then with one deep breath she began to sing. Her voice was not polished, not trained by professionals, yet it was pure, raw, and unshaken. The song was not one of celebration or joy, but one of truth, a melody about children who walked miles, barefoot to reach schools that were crumbling, about the empty stomachs that still dreamed of books, about the teachers who gave everything despite having nothing. It was a song of pain, of resilience, of quiet hope that refused to die. At first, the audience was simply listening, curious. But within minutes, something shifted. Words cut deeper than music sometimes does, and Kavya's voice carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten stories. People felt their eyes sting, their throats tighten. Even hardened officials who had spent decades in politics found themselves staring at the floor, unable to meet her gaze, because her voice made them remember promises unfulfilled. When the camera turned to Prime Minister Modi, he was no longer composed. His eyes shimmered with tears he could not hold back. A leader who had stood firm through countless storms, who had addressed the nation in moments of war and tragedy without his voice trembling, was now silently weeping in front of a child. He raised his hand once to wipe his face, then lowered it quickly, as though ashamed of letting the nation see his vulnerability. But it was too late. The entire hall had seen. In the third row, Sundar Pichai sat quietly. Unlike most of the audience, he was not shocked by the song. He had seen pain like this before. He had lived through days where his family rationed food, where one extra candle meant a sacrifice, where his father's salary was not enough to afford books, and yet dreams still survived. Sundar's face was calm, almost unreadable, but inside, memories were opening like old wounds. Kavya's trembling voice was not just singing a song, it was pulling him back into his own childhood, into a time when he too had wondered if he would ever escape the walls of limitation that seemed to surround him. As Kavya sang the final verse, her voice cracked. It was not because she forgot the words, but because her own emotions were rising like a storm. She had written this song with her teacher, using scraps of paper at night, whispering the lines so as not to disturb her siblings who slept on the floor beside her. Every word she sang tonight came from a place of lived truth. Not imagination. The last note lingered in the air longer than expected, as though even the sound itself did not want to leave. And then came silence. Heavy, unbroken silence. For 10 long seconds, no one clapped. No one moved. It was not the silence of indifference, but of shock, of reverence, of hearts struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Then the hall erupted. Applause thundered like waves crashing against rocks. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even shouting her name. Kavya stood stunned, her eyes wide, unsure if she should smile or cry. She looked for her teacher in the crowd, and when she found her nodding with pride, she allowed herself the smallest smile. But among the noise, Sundar remained still. He was clapping, but softly, his eyes locked on the child as though he had just recognized something no one else had. Modi ji leaned back in his chair, his face still damp with tears, shaking his head slowly as if in disbelief at what had just unfolded. What the audience did not know was that Kavya's song had not been meant as mere art. It was, in truth, a cry for help. Her school was on the verge of shutting down. Funds had dried up, teachers were leaving, and children were dropping out. Kavya's headmaster had sent letters to the government, but they had been ignored. This performance, arranged through a chance opportunity by an NGO, was their last desperate attempt to be heard. As the applause began to fade, the moderator walked onto the stage, ready to move the program forward. But before he could speak, Sundar Pichai rose slowly from his seat. The cameras immediately swung toward him. A ripple of whispers spread through the hall like electricity. What was he doing? Why was he standing? Prime Minister Modi turned to look at him, surprise written across his face. The ministers exchanged glances, unsure. The children in the back straightened, eyes widening. Sundar adjusted his jacket, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. The hall went still again, a second silence falling heavier than the first. Sundar walked toward the stage, each step echoing. When he reached the stairs and placed his hand on the railing, Kavya froze, staring at him with disbelief. She had seen his face only in newspapers, in textbooks, in articles that spoke of his rise to becoming one of the most powerful men in technology. She never imagined he would be standing in front of her, closing the distance. He took the microphone gently from her small hands. For a moment, he looked at her, then at the audience. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried weight. What she sang tonight is not just a song, he said slowly, letting the words settle. It is a reminder. It is a mirror. It is the truth of millions of children in our country who deserve better, who deserve hope. Every ear leaned closer. Journalists raised their pens, cameras zoomed. Sundar's tone was steady, but there was something beneath it, an unspoken personal connection, as if these were not just lines of sympathy but echoes of his own life. He paused, looked at Modi ji, and continued. When I listened to her, I remembered something I have not spoken about for many years, something I thought I had left behind. But tonight, through Kavya, it returned to me. The hall was trembling with anticipation. Sundar's eyes softened as he looked once more at the little girl who had unknowingly unlocked his past. And then, in a voice that was both fragile and firm, he said, I think it is time I tell you a story I never planned to share. The crowd drew in a collective breath. Kavya's hands trembled, her eyes filling with tears she did not understand. Modi ji leaned forward, his face tense with curiosity. Everyone knew that something extraordinary was about to be revealed. But before Sundar could utter the next line, the lights flickered, the sound system crackled. The audience murmured, some thinking it was a technical issue, but the atmosphere was already charged with suspense. Sundar raised his hand, signaling patience. He waited until the silence returned, and then, just as he opened his mouth again, the screen behind him lit up with a picture no one expected. A black and white photograph of a boy, sitting on a cracked wooden bench in a tiny classroom, holding a second-hand notebook with missing pages. The boy looked thin, his hair messy, his shirt faded from countless washes. But in his eyes, there was the same quiet fire the world had just seen in Kavya. Gasps spread through the hall. Sundar turned to look at the photograph, and for the first time that night, his composure wavered. The boy in the picture was him. The hall erupted again, this time not with applause but with stunned silence and whispers that grew louder by the second. Sundar turned back to the microphone. His voice was lower now, trembling just enough to make everyone lean closer. Yes, he said. That boy was me. And then he stopped, leaving the entire hall suspended on the edge of revelation. Sundar's forgotten past, the hall was trembling, with the weight of silence. No one shifted, no one whispered, no one even dared to cough. Sundar Pichai stood on the stage, a tall man in a dark suit, but in that moment he was not the CEO of the world's most powerful tech company. He was not the man who had stood beside presidents or announced products that reached billions. He was simply a boy again, a boy staring back at his younger self projected on the screen behind him. The photograph was grainy, its edges blurred, but it carried a truth sharper than any words. A classroom with cracked walls, paint peeling, a broken fan dangling from the ceiling, and benches so old they seemed ready to collapse. And there, in the middle of it all, sat a thin boy with large, questioning eyes. He was holding a second-hand notebook so worn that the cover was torn off, its pages frayed like tired cloth. Sundar's voice was quiet when he began to speak again, but it reached every corner of the hall. This was me, many years ago, before America, before Silicon Valley, before everything you have read about me. He paused, his eyes moving over the audience. I grew up in a small house in Chennai. 1 room, 2 fans, no refrigerator, no television. When we were lucky, we had enough to eat. When we were not, we made do with what we had. The ministers in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their heads. The children, however, leaned closer. Kavya was staring at him, her lips parted, as though his words were weaving directly into her heart. My father worked for the railways, Sundar continued, his tone steady but tinged with memory. He was not a rich man, but he believed in something greater than money. He believed in education. He believed that books could open doors that nothing else could. I remember the nights he sat me down and explained things he had learned from engineering, things I could barely understand at that age. He would tell me, "One day you will go further than I ever could. One day you will take India with you." His voice broke slightly at the last line, and the hall felt it. "We did not own a phone when I was a child," Sundar said. "The first time we got one, I must have been 12 or 13. I still remember dialing numbers, feeling the weight of each click. It amazed me that pressing buttons could connect you to another person's voice. That was the first spark. The first time I thought, what if technology could be more than a tool for the rich? What if it could belong to everyone?" He turned toward the photograph again, and his eyes softened. "But dreams are not enough. I faced rejection, humiliation. I remember once in college standing in line to use a computer. I had studied all the theory. I had memorized the diagrams, but I had never touched one. When my turn came, my hand shook so badly that another student laughed and said, 'Maybe this is not for you.' A murmur ran through the audience. Sundar let the silence stretch before he spoke again. I went home that night, and for the first time I questioned myself. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was not for me. I looked at my father, at my mother, at how much they had sacrificed just to put me through school, and I felt ashamed. I wanted to give up." He paused, his eyes lingering on Kavya. "That feeling you sang about, Kavya, of walking miles for something that may not even exist at the end, I know it. I have lived it. The world tells you that you are not enough, that your place is already decided, that dreams are for someone else. But there is always one voice that can break that lie. For me, it was my father's voice. He said, 'Sundar, you do not give up. You keep walking. Even if your shoes tear, even if your feet bleed, you keep walking.'" Prime Minister Modi shifted forward in his seat, his hand still resting on his chin. He was not simply listening as a leader. He was listening as a man who had walked his own long path, who had known his own share of hunger and sacrifice. Sundar continued, his voice now carrying more strength. "I was rejected many times. When I applied for scholarships, when I sought opportunities, doors closed. People laughed at my accent, at my clothes, at my silence. I was too shy, too quiet, they said. In America, I was an outsider. In India, I was a boy too poor to matter. But through every rejection, I remembered my father's words. I remembered the weight of his hands, rough from work, pushing me forward. His words fell like stones in a still pond, each one creating ripples in the hearts of those listening." He took a deep breath, as though steadying himself before revealing more. "But there is something I have never told in public. Something that even many of my closest colleagues do not know." The audience leaned forward. The hall seemed to tighten. "When I was 17, I wrote a letter," Sundar said slowly. "A letter meant for someone powerful, someone I thought could change things for children like me. I never posted it. I never found the courage. It stayed hidden in my books, folded, gathering dust. In that letter, I wrote about a dream. A dream that one day India's children would not have to beg for education, would not have to choose between food and books. I wrote that one day technology would not be a luxury but a right. The silence grew heavier. Kavya's eyes widened. She whispered softly, though no one heard except herself. A letter? Sundar nodded, as though he had heard her anyway. Yes, I was too afraid. I thought who would listen to a boy like me? Who would care about my words? So I kept it hidden. And I carried the weight of that silence with me for many years. He stopped, his voice softer now. Tonight, when Kavya sang, I felt as though that letter had finally found its way back to me. Her song was my letter, sent across time. She sang what I once wrote, and she reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. That silence is the greatest enemy of change. Gasps moved through the hall. Journalists scribbled furiously, some even wiping their eyes. Sundar placed the microphone back on the stand and let the weight of his confession sink in. I do not know where that letter is now. I lost it in the chaos of life, but I know its spirit survived. It survived in her voice. And it tells me that perhaps it is not too late. Perhaps what I once dreamed we can still build. Not for me, but for them. He extended his hand toward the rows of children seated at the back, their eyes shining with a mix of awe and fear and longing. And then, just as the audience thought, his story was done. Sundar lowered his head slightly, his voice almost breaking. But before I tell you what I intend to do, he said, pausing deliberately, I must confess something even deeper, something that might change the way you see me. The audience stiffened. Modiji's face hardened with focus. Kavya leaned forward so far her teacher gently pulled her back by the sleeve. Sundar's hand tightened on the microphone. There was a moment when I almost left India behind. A moment when I felt India did not want me, and I must tell you why. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. The letter never delivered. The hall was still trembling from Sundar's last words. A man who had stood at the top of the world, a man who had spoken in Silicon Valley, Washington, and Delhi, was now standing on a stage confessing something most of his admirers had never imagined. That once, he had almost turned his back on the country of his birth. The weight of his honesty pressed against everyone in the auditorium. People who had come expecting a polished speech about technology or opportunity were instead being pulled into the raw, unfiltered story of a boy's survival. A boy who became a man but never forgot the bruises of his journey. Sundar took a slow breath and his eyes softened as he looked at the faces in front of him. He did not see ministers or journalists or industry leaders anymore. He saw children. Children like he once was, sitting in the corners of classrooms with their notebooks half filled because their families could not afford more pages. He saw the reflection of his own hungry nights, his own lonely mornings. And then he began again. When I first left India to study abroad, he said, his voice low and steady, I carried two things with me. One was my father's sacrifice. The years of saving every rupee to make sure I could fly to America. The other was guilt. Guilt that I was leaving behind not only my family but my country, the very children I had once promised myself I would help. He looked down briefly, as though ashamed to meet their eyes. America gave me opportunities. It gave me libraries that never closed, computers that did not break, networks that moved faster than I had ever dreamed possible. But it also gave me silence. Silence in classrooms where my accent was mocked. Silence in corridors where I felt invisible. I would eat alone sometimes, wondering if the world had already decided who belonged and who did not. The audience was hushed, listening not to the CEO of Google but to a young man stripped of his titles, carrying nothing but his vulnerability. There were nights when I sat in my small dorm room, Sundar continued, staring at the walls, wondering if I had betrayed India. I thought maybe the other student was right. Maybe technology was not for me. Maybe I was meant to remain small. I considered giving up. I considered never coming back. The room stiffened. Modiji shifted slightly, his hand tightening on the armrest of his chair. Kavya's eyes were wide, her lips trembling because in Sundar's words she heard her own doubts echoing back at her. Then Sundar's voice softened, almost to a whisper. But in those moments of despair, I would remember the letter. The word itself seemed to strike the hall like a sudden drumbeat. Journalists lifted their pens. The children at the back leaned closer. Sundar nodded slowly, his gaze far away as though he were staring into the past. I wrote that letter when I was 17, before I ever touched an airplane, before I ever knew what the world outside India looked like. I wrote it sitting at my desk with the dim yellow light of a kerosene lamp while my mother cooked quietly in the next room. It was addressed to no one and everyone. I wanted it to reach someone powerful, someone who could change things. Maybe a minister, maybe a leader, maybe even the Prime Minister of India. I did not even know the right address to send it to. All I knew was that I had to write. His words carried the weight of memory, and the audience seemed to see it with him. The thin boy bent over a notebook, his handwriting neat but nervous, the ink smudging slightly on cheap paper. In that letter, Sundar said slowly, I poured everything. I wrote about how we studied without fans in the summer heat, how our books fell apart, how teachers tried to stretch lessons with nothing but chalk and willpower. I wrote about how children deserved a future where technology was not locked behind wealth. I wrote that one day, if given a chance, I would help build such a future. And when I finished writing, I folded the pages carefully, placed them in an envelope, and held it against my chest. His voice dropped even lower, but I never sent it. A murmur rippled through the hall. Sundar closed his eyes briefly, as though reliving the moment. I never sent it because I was afraid. I thought, who would listen to me? I was just a boy in a modest home, my shoes worn, my world small. I thought the letter would be laughed at, discarded, lost. So I kept it hidden, tucked away inside a book, where it stayed for years. And as time passed, I buried it deeper in my mind as well. I chased opportunities, I worked hard, I climbed, but the guilt of that unsent letter never left me. It followed me like a shadow. The audience was still as stone. Some ministers avoided eye contact with each other, realizing how many letters, like Sundar's, had gone unheard. How many voices like Kavya's had been left in silence. Sundar's face grew more solemn. When I was in America, and I faced those moments of loneliness, that letter whispered to me. It asked, did you abandon us? Did you forget us? And there were nights when I believed the answer was yes. He turned his gaze back to Kavya, and his voice trembled. But tonight, through her song, I heard my own words again. I heard the same plea, the same fire, the same truth. It was as if my 17-year-old self had finally spoken, not through my pen, but through her voice. And it reminded me of something I almost lost, that no child's dream should ever be silenced. The hall was holding its breath. Modi Ji's eyes glistened again, though he quickly blinked, hiding it. The children were spellbound, their hearts pounding with recognition. Then Sundar straightened his shoulders, his tone changing, rising with resolve. So I must confess this to you now. I regret never sending that letter. I regret the silence I allowed. But regret can be turned into action. Regret can become responsibility. Tonight, I want to honor the letter I never delivered by listening to Kavya's voice and by listening to every child who dares to dream. The audience erupted into applause, though it carried more weight than before. This was not polite clapping. It was thunderous, raw, filled with something deeper, a recognition that they were witnessing not just a story but a turning point. Sundar raised his hand gently and the applause slowed, then stopped. His voice, when it returned, was steady but solemn. But before we talk of what comes next, he said, his eyes locked on the children in the back rows, I must tell you the truth of how close I came to abandoning India completely. Because it was not just loneliness. It was something darker, something that still haunts me. The air thickened with suspense. People leaned forward, their eyes fixed on him. There was a day, Sundar said slowly, when I decided I would never return, a day when I felt India had no place for me, and it all began with one phone call. The audience gasped softly. Modi ji sat upright. Kavya's breath caught in her throat. Sundar's hand tightened on the microphone as though bracing himself. That phone call, he said, his voice heavy with memory, changed everything. And until tonight I have never spoken of it aloud. The challenge, the hall was a storm of silence after Sundar's final words in part 3. People leaned forward, waiting, straining to hear more, their hearts caught between disbelief and anticipation. Sundar had just revealed that a phone call long ago had nearly severed his connection with India. But before he gave details, he paused, as though weighing whether the truth was too heavy to share. And then, instead of going deeper into that memory, he straightened, his expression changing from vulnerability to determination. His voice rang through the hall with renewed strength. I have carried regret for many years, he said. But tonight cannot only be about stories and memories. Tonight must be about action. Kavya's voice has reminded me of a promise I made as a boy, a promise I buried, but which has now returned. And I intend to honor it. The words landed like a drumbeat. People shifted in their seats, ministers sat up taller, and journalists clutched their pens, sensing that history was about to be made. Sundar looked at Kavya, who was still standing on the stage, frozen in disbelief at what she was hearing. Her small hands twisted nervously, her eyes wide. He lowered his head slightly as though speaking directly to her. Your school is in danger, he said. Your community is struggling. And I could write a check tonight. I could send resources, and perhaps the problem would be solved for a short while. But that is not enough. Money alone cannot change the future of children. What changes the future is strength, unity, resilience, and kindness. A murmur swept through the audience. Sundar let the silence settle again before continuing. So here is my promise. I will support your school. I will bring resources, teachers, technology, and opportunities. But only if you and your friends accept a challenge. Not a challenge of exams or grades, but a challenge of character. The hall stilled again, the atmosphere charged with suspense. Sundar spoke with careful clarity. Together, you must create something new, something that shows the world who you are and what you believe in. It may be small, it may be simple, but it must be built with resilience, with respect, with humility, and with kindness. No insults, no giving up, no stepping on each other to get ahead. If you can do this, if you can stand together and show that even children from a struggling school can build something beautiful, then I will not only save your school, I will make sure its story inspires every child in India. The hall erupted. Some clapped, some gasped, some murmured in disbelief. Kavya stared at him, stunned, unable to speak. Her teacher placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Say yes." But her throat was too tight to form words. Finally, Sundar turned back to the audience. This is not a gift, he said firmly. This is a chance, and sometimes a chance is more powerful than charity. The applause that followed was thunderous, though not unanimous. In the back rows, a few officials whispered to one another with doubt, frowning. The challenge was inspiring. Yes. But could poor children really succeed where many wealthier schools had failed? Later that evening, as the auditorium emptied and the lights dimmed, Kavya sat quietly with her classmates in a small corner room. The children's faces were a mix of excitement and fear. Some whispered eagerly about what they could build, while others shook their heads, muttering that it was impossible. Kavya listened, her hands resting on her lap, her heart racing. She thought of her song, of the tears she had seen in Modi ji's eyes, of Sundar's quiet, powerful voice. Part of her felt as though destiny itself had called her name, and yet another part trembled with doubt. She was only 12. How could she lead anyone? The next morning, the challenge began. Sundar's team arrived at the small school, carrying boxes of donated computers, books, and simple tools. The sight of them drew a crowd from the community. Parents stood at the gates watching. Nervously, teachers whispered among themselves, unsure if they could guide the children through something so ambitious. The children gathered in the dusty courtyard, forming a circle. Sundar stood among them, his presence calm but commanding. Today you begin, he said. Remember, this is not about perfection, this is about resilience and kindness. Your true success will not be in what you build, but in how you build it. At first, the children were excited. They talked loudly, throwing out ideas. A library, a small website, a community garden, a science project. Their voices overlapped, their energy overflowing. But soon the excitement turned into conflict. Arguments broke out. Some children dismissed others' ideas. A few laughed at mistakes. And when the first computer froze while booting, frustration spread like wildfire. Kavya tried to calm them, but her voice was lost in the noise. She watched as her classmates bickered, their faces flushed with anger, their words sharp. The more they argued, the more her confidence slipped away. Days passed, and the pressure grew. Newspapers began to report on the challenge. Some celebrated it as a bold experiment, while others mocked it as naive. How can poor children who barely pass their exams create something meaningful? One headline sneered. The criticism seeped into the children's hearts, making them doubt themselves even more. Kavya felt the weight of it most of all. At night, she lay awake on the thin mattress she shared with her sisters, staring at the ceiling, replaying every harsh word spoken in the courtyard. She wondered if Sundar had made a mistake by trusting her. And then one evening, after another long day of arguments and failures, Kavya sat alone by the window of her small home. The street outside was noisy with vendors and scooters, but her world was quiet. She held her notebook, the same one where she had written the song, and opened to a blank page. Her hands shook as she wrote, "I am failing them. I cannot lead. Maybe I was only meant to sing once and then fade away." Her tears fell on the page, smudging the ink. She closed the notebook quickly, pressing it to her chest as if trying to hide her weakness from the world. The next morning, Kavya did not arrive at school. At first, her classmates assumed she was sick. But when the hours passed and her seat remained empty, whispers began to spread. Her teacher checked her home, but the family said she had gone out early and never returned. Panic rippled through the school. Sundar, who had been preparing to visit that afternoon, was informed immediately. His face grew grave. When the children returned to the courtyard, they found something on the bench where Kavya usually sat. It was her notebook. On the cover, in shaky handwriting, she had written only 4 words. "For whoever believes more." The children opened it slowly, and inside they found not just her doubts, but pages filled with dreams, sketches, and hopes she had never spoken aloud. Plans for the library, songs for the community, drawings of gardens, even small designs for a classroom painted in bright colors. It was her heart poured onto paper. As they turned the pages, silence fell. Guilt tightened their throats. They realized that while they had been arguing and mocking, Kavya had been carrying the weight of all their hopes. And somewhere in that silence, far away, Sundar Pichai closed his eyes. The challenge had just taken a turn no one had expected. The Diary of Dreams. The courtyard of the little school was unnaturally quiet. The children, who only a day before had been arguing over ideas and shouting in frustration, now stood still in a circle around the old wooden bench. On it lay the small notebook Kavya had left behind. Its cover was thin, its corners bent, the pages bulging slightly from where rain or tears had once touched them. On the front, in her careful but trembling handwriting, were the words, "For whoever believes more." No one touched it at first. It was as if the notebook was alive, breathing, holding a weight too sacred to disturb. The children stared at it, their eyes flickering with guilt, with fear, with longing. Their teacher, her eyes rimmed with worry, stepped forward and lifted it gently, almost like lifting a fragile bird. She opened to the first page. Inside, Kavya had written a letter. The words were uneven, the ink sometimes smudged, but the honesty was sharp, unbroken. "To my friends, my teachers, and anyone who finds this, I am sorry I could not be stronger. I tried, but I feel I am too small for this big task. Still, I do not want my dreams to die with me, so I am leaving them here. Maybe one of you will believe enough to carry them forward. As the teacher read aloud, the courtyard grew heavy, with silence. Children lowered their heads ashamed, remembering how they had argued, how they had mocked, how they had pushed Kavya into despair. Sundar Pichai, who had just arrived and now stood at the gate, listened with his face solemn, his hands folded. The teacher turned the page and the children gasped. Kavya had filled it not with sadness alone but with visions. One page held a drawing of a bright library with shelves made from painted wooden boxes, filled with books she imagined they might one day have. Another page carried a song she had written, simple lines about kindness, each verse ending with the refrain, "We rise by lifting each other." Further pages contained sketches of gardens planted with flowers and vegetables, with little notes in the margins. This could feed our midday meals. The deeper they read, the more the diary revealed. Ideas for painting the dull school walls with bright colors, plans for a small website to tell the world about their school, lists of things she hoped each student could contribute. Anjali is good with drawing, she could paint the walls. Ramesh can fix broken chairs. Meena sings better than me, she could lead us. Every page was a reminder that while they had been wasting time in arguments, Kavya had quietly been dreaming for them all. The teacher's voice broke as she turned to one of the final entries. "I am afraid I will fail, but I believe if we try with love, even failure will be beautiful. And if we succeed, it will not be mine alone. It will belong to everyone who chose kindness over pride." The children could not hold back their tears. Some covered their faces, some wept openly. Their shame was heavy. But beneath it something else was stirring. A determination born from her words, a fire lit by her sacrifice. Sundar stepped forward then, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you see what she has done? This diary is more powerful than any technology, more powerful than any speech I could give. She has given you a blueprint, not of machines or computers, but of hearts. She has shown you that the greatest creations are not built by hands alone, but by kindness and belief." The community that had gathered outside the gates was listening too. Mothers with tired faces, fathers with calloused hands, neighbors who had once scoffed at the challenge. They stood in silence, humbled by the words of a child. But not everyone was moved. In the days that followed, opposition began to grow louder. A group of local officials, embarrassed by the national attention and fearful of losing control, began to argue that the challenge was foolish. "These are children," one of them declared in a meeting. "They cannot carry such responsibility. They will fail, and then people will blame us." Another scoffed, "Pichai has lived abroad too long. He does not understand how things really work here." Rumors spread quickly. Some newspapers picked them up, printing headlines like, "Impossible expectations placed on village school children and experiment doomed to fail." The children heard the whispers in the marketplace. Their parents heard the doubts at work. Fear began to creep back into their hearts. And then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Prime Minister Modi arrived quietly at the school. There were no cameras, no announcements, no journalists. He came with only 2 aides, slipping in under the cover of dusk. When Sundar greeted him, surprise flickered across his face. "Why are you here, sir?" Sundar asked softly. Modi's voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of both power and vulnerability. "Because I cannot allow this light to be extinguished. What Kavya began, what these children are struggling for, it matters more than politics, more than headlines. It matters for India." Sundar studied him, the memory of the tears he had seen in the auditorium flashing in his mind. "Will you stand with us openly?" he asked. Modi shook his head slowly. "Not yet. If I step in publicly, it will become about me, about parties, about votes. I do not want that. This must remain about them. But know this, I will support you quietly. If obstacles rise, if powers move against you, you will not be alone." The 2 men stood in silence for a long moment, united not by status, but by something deeper, the shared recognition of a child's courage. Meanwhile, The children, now holding Kavya's diary like a sacred text, began to change. The arguments lessened. When someone made a mistake, others helped instead of mocking. They painted the first corner of the classroom with bright colors from donated paint. They planted a small patch of earth with seeds borrowed from neighbors. They sang Kavya's song as they worked, their voices shaky at first, then stronger until it became their anthem. The community too began to soften. Mothers brought food for the children during long evenings of work. Fathers fixed old tools. Even neighbors who had once doubted began to watch with cautious respect. The diary's words spread like ripples, reaching beyond the school walls. But the opposition did not vanish. As the day of the final presentation drew near, the day Sundar had promised to return and witness what they had built, the pressure mounted. Rumors of sabotage began to circulate. Some whispered that officials might shut down the event. Others feared that the children would falter under the weight of expectation. And then, on the eve of the final test, the unthinkable happened. Kavya, who had been missing since leaving her diary, returned to the village. But she did not come quietly. She arrived weak, her face pale, her steps unsteady. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire community was gathered outside her home. Her mother wept with relief. Her father held her hand tightly, but everyone could see something was wrong. She was ill, her body fragile, her voice faint. When Sundar entered the room and saw her lying there, the diary resting on the bedside table, his chest tightened. She smiled weakly, whispering, "Did they read it?" Sundar nodded, his voice breaking. "Yes, Kavya, they read it, and it changed everything." She closed her eyes for a moment as if holding on to the image of her friends building together. Then she whispered again, "Good. Then my part is done." The room fell into stunned silence. Sundar leaned closer, his voice urgent but gentle. "No, Kavya. Your part is not done. Tomorrow is the day. They need you." She opened her eyes slowly, and in them burned the faint but unmistakable light of resilience. "Then I will be there," she whispered, "no matter what." The community, the children, and even Sundar himself held their breath, wondering if her fragile body could truly rise for one final stand. The voice that changed India's the morning of the final presentation arrived heavy with anticipation. The school courtyard, once a place of dust and silence, was now alive with color and energy. The walls had been painted with bright hues of red, yellow, and blue, each stroke carrying the laughter and sweat of children who had worked late into the nights. Small saplings lined the edges of the yard, their leaves trembling in the gentle breeze. In one corner, shelves made from old crates stood proudly, holding the few books the children had managed to gather. It was not grand, not polished, but it was alive. It was theirs. The community gathered in numbers larger than anyone had expected. Mothers with babies in their arms, fathers who had taken time off work, grandparents leaning on canes, neighbors curious to see what the children had created. All stood together, filling the courtyard with murmurs of pride and nervousness. And at the far end, journalists with cameras and notebooks pressed forward, ready to capture every moment. But the children's eyes were not on the crowd. They were fixed on the entrance, waiting for her.